All right, it is 12:30, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Sims. I am the Assistant Director of Internships and Experiential Learning here at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Open Classroom series. If you haven't been to an open classroom before, it is the Brown School's virtual and free professional development series. Beyond Open Classroom, we do have several learning, continuing education opportunities offered throughout the year. I'm dropping links into the chat, and you can also use the QR code on the screen to visit our website. Before we get started, I have just some very brief housekeeping items. First, as you may have noticed already, we are in a Zoom webinar. That just means that we can't see or hear you, but we really do want to engage with you. And the chat is open to everybody. You can chat to the entire group of participants, or you can chat just to the hosts and panelists. We invite you to say hello in the chat now if you would like. And then throughout the presentation, we also invite you to leave any comments and especially any questions that you have for our presenter, because there will be time at the end for some Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, although we are expecting a very big group today, so we might not get to everybody's. The final bit of housekeeping is that I did want to note that for this program, we do have an ASL interpreter with us, and she is pinned on the screen and will remain so the entire time, so that if you do need ASL interpretation, you should be able to access that pretty quickly. I see a question in the chat asking where the interpreter is. I've pinned her to the top, and she has herself labeled as interpreter. All right, so let's get started with our program. Let me find my notes. All right, so today's Open Classroom is specifically part of our Black History Month series, which we do every year, a time in which we honor and commemorate our African American ancestors, contemporaries, and the next generation, as well as co-conspirators who have gone above and beyond in every aspect of the preservation, expression, and appreciation of Black labor, creativity, strength, and innovation. This year's theme for Black History Month is Strength in Labor, the legacy and future of African American contributions. I would quickly like to acknowledge and thank the entire Black History Month Planning Committee, especially our co-chairs who are here today, Ms. Cynthia Williams and Amber Brown. Amber will be facilitating the Q&A at the end. And I invite everybody to check out our Black History Month website, which is in the chat, and I will link that again if you joined recently. So finally, one of the things that we do for Black History Month is a land and labor acknowledgement. You can read the full acknowledgement at our website, but I'm going to share an abbreviated script here today. As we celebrate 100 years of education, service, and community impact spanning local, national, and international spheres, the Brown School honors the land we gather on and the labor of Indigenous, Black, immigrant, American-born, and other marginalized communities whose contributions have profoundly shaped St. Louis and our institution. We recognize the injustices endured and the sacrifices and contributions of these communities whose exploited labor and unwavering resilience have strengthened the university and our broader region. This acknowledgement reflects our steadfast commitment to equity, justice, and community partnership as we look to the future. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield. She is the Mary Tilson Hemingway Professor of Arts and Sciences and Assistant Vice Provost at Washington University in St. Louis, where she co-directs the Office of Public Scholarship. Professor Wingfield's research examines how racial and gender inequality persist in professional occupations and has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including American Psychological Review, American Journal of Sociology, and the annual review of sociology. She is the author of several books, most recently, Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It, which was listed as one of Publishers Weekly's best books of 2023. Professor Wingfield is also the recipient of multiple awards, including the Richard A. Lester Award from Princeton University, the Cox Johnson Fraser Award from the American Psychological Association, and the C. Wright Mills Award from the Society for the Study of Social Problems. She also regularly writes for mainstream outlets such as The Atlantic, Slate, and Harvard Business Review. Professor Wingfield is the 116th president of the American Psychological Association and fellow of the Canadian Institute for the Advancement of Research, and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Adia Wingfield.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that invitation and for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here to talk with you all a bit about my recent research in gray areas. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in hopes that it works and that we can successfully have this presentation. Oops. Okay. Hopefully what you're seeing on your screen now is the title slide. As mentioned, the title of the presentation today and of my recent book on this topic is called Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It. And I think it's useful to start off with a little bit of statistical data, just in terms of thinking about the demographics of the United States and of our workplaces. So if we look at US racial demographics from 2019, census data shows us that our racial demographics in the US are actually pretty mixed and increasing to trend in this direction. Non-Hispanic white women and men constitute about 30% each of the population. Black women and men constitute about 7 or 6%, about 13% of the US population total. Hispanic men and women constitute about 18% of the total population, and Asian American men and women constitute about 6% of our population. So as we see, we have a growing number of groups of color that are increasingly becoming part of US population demographics. This picture looks a lot different, though, than what we look at when we see the percent of white male workers in various jobs. As of 2017, what we know from data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics was that white male workers were 80% of our congressional representatives, they were 78% of state political executives, 85% of corporate executive officers, 100% of the CEOs of Wall Street firms, 95% of Fortune 500 CEOs, 73% of tenured professors, 97% of the heads of venture capital firms, and 97% of the owners of television and radio licenses. And in the intervening 8 years, these data have pretty much stayed the same and not necessarily skewed widely in either direction. So what we have here is a pretty significant mismatch between what the population of the US looks like and what the representation of workers in the most elite, high status, influential, and significant jobs in the United States look like as well. And looking at this disparity, I think, gives rise to particular questions that are useful to ask in thinking about why we have this disparity present in the first place and what it stems from. We know, for example, that when we take the broader look at the history of race and work today, that racial discrimination has been outlawed since the 1960s, when the 1964 Civil Rights Act decided that racial discrimination was illegal. In the wake of that, we can look at DEI and see that it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. This is the case up until recent events have taken a hit for the DEI industry, but it is still one that over time has built into a very lucrative field and a very lucrative industry. We also know that workers of all races report an interest in workplaces that address diversity. We're much more likely to see workers state from survey data that they want to work in places where diversity is valued and that this is something that is important and meaningful to them. But we also know that at the same time that we've seen this growing rise in diversity and this commitment to workers, at least, on wanting to see more diversity in their workplaces, that there are some gaps here. Black workers in particular remain underrepresented in leadership roles across industries. As I just noted, this is true for many of the most high sector and influential jobs in our field careers in our, high sector and influential career fields. But this is also the case in fields that are more mundane: academia, medicine and healthcare, engineering, finance, and so forth. Black workers are also subject to racial wage gaps that do not disappear, but actually widen with increased education. And they are concentrated in lower status occupations with little job security or prospects for mobility. So, on the one hand, we have a society where there has been more attention to and acknowledgement of the importance of diversity, but one that has not actually managed to meet this promise. And so, what I try to think about in gray areas is how we can explain and understand this paradox of being in a society where diversity has taken more and more of a front role, but yet has not necessarily managed to achieve the results that one might expect. Oops, sorry. What I argue in the book is that there are reasons why we see these disparities present when diversity is a multi-billion-dollar industry, why these inequalities persist 50 plus years after the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, and why the top ranks of so many industries fail to reflect an increasingly diverse population. And there are a few things that I argue this is not the cause of, and one core argument that I make that does explain this. There's not any data to suggest that this disparity is a result of a lack of qualified Black workers. Black workers have actually been increasing their educational attainment pretty steadily over the past 25 to 30 years. It is also not a result of legal explicit racial discrimination. We know again that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited the legal use of such discrimination in workplaces and occupations. So we no longer live in an environment where companies can legally say that they are refusing to hire workers because they are Black. We no longer live in an environment where Black workers are underrepresented among the highest ranks of educational sectors and are lacking qualifications or experience that would seem to facilitate their entry into these types of jobs. But what I argue in my research and what I'll argue today is that when we look more closely at the way we work actually contributes to much of the racial inequality that we continue to see and helps to explain why the promise of more diversity has not necessarily been realized. In gray areas, I talk about three core areas of how we work: hiring, organizational culture, and advancement. I look at how these three processes are structured, at the norms and expectations associated with each, how they are constructed in ways that systematically exclude and disadvantage Black workers, and then I ask a key question, which is how can we do better? And there's a lot of research that does document ways that organizations can change, but I firmly believe that in order to understand how these changes can happen, we have to first diagnose and understand the problem. And that's what I'll talk about today. In order to make this case, I follow in gray areas 7 Black workers from a variety of fields and backgrounds. There is Constance, who is a chemical engineer, Kevin, a worker at a nonprofit, Brian, a film producer, Max, an emergency medicine doctor, Alex, who drives for Uber Eats and mostly does gig work, Amalia, who is a journalist, and Darren, who is a financial executive. And you'll notice that these workers come from a variety of different backgrounds and fields, from STEM to more artistic endeavors to patching together gig work to working in high-ranking positions in the financial industry. And that's not by accident. This broad, varied background of workers is designed to highlight the ways that even when Black workers are employed in a variety of different sectors, regardless of their background, educational attainment, industry in which they are employed, one commonality that we see consistently is that these gray areas of work, the unspoken aspects of how we do our jobs that are not necessarily embedded into the particulars of our job contracts and our specified work responsibilities, still have an impact on shaping and impacting the outcomes that are present for workers in a variety of different occupations and professions. So I want to start here with a discussion of hiring. When we talk about hiring, researchers know that managers often go through a process of telling themselves a story. Hiring managers notoriously are often inundated with an enormous number of applications, such that they rarely have time to spend a lot of time on each one. Data has shown that hiring managers can spend as little as 2 to 3 minutes on every application that they review. And so because they are going through a large amount of data in a very short period of time, they rely on telling themselves a story to make sense of the information that they are reviewing. Now, we also know from economists that in some cases, the stories that hiring managers can tell can be ones that embody aspects of discrimination. There is statistical discrimination, where managers may draw conclusions about an individual worker from data that may be broadly true of a group, but may not necessarily be applicable to that particular worker. And there's preferential discrimination, where managers may draw conclusions about a particular worker based on their own stereotypes, preconceptions, and ideas about the worker or the group to which they belong. But a consistent factor that we know is a pattern of our contemporary hiring processes is that managers often rely very heavily on social networks and connections in order to make a decision about hiring and who will advance further in the hiring process versus who does not. And this process of relying on social networks means that managers are often heavily emphasizing the connections that they have, the relationships that they have with others that are in the organization or outside of it, and that those processes are a key way by which workers find their way into the organization. But they are also a key way in which we want to consider how this reliance on hiring and social networks can disadvantage Black workers. To highlight this, I'll use some examples from Constance. Constance, as I mentioned before, is a professor of chemical engineering. She has degrees from some of the top universities in the United States, and she would be the first to admit that networks got her in the door to her current job. When Constance was finishing her PhD, she had a lot of doubts about her career path. She was uncertain about whether she had what it took to succeed in a research-driven career, and she was very uncertain about what type of career path she should pursue. And she found out that upon expressing these concerns to her dissertation advisor, he was very encouraging and he supported her in her efforts to find a research job. She also learned that he leveraged his own connections to vouch for her and to make a case for colleagues that she would be a good hire. But what Constance didn't anticipate was that she changed specialty areas upon starting her job, and that this required rebuilding her networks all on her own. So when we think about this process of changing specialty areas, one way that I think is useful to think about it is that while Constance was trained in a particular area of chemical engineering, the job that she took was a bit broader. And that meant that the relationships that she had built through graduate school were not necessarily very valuable or applicable once she moved into the new profession. It would be like for me as a sociology professor, getting a degree in sociology and then perhaps taking a job in a business school. The work that I do would still be applicable, but the connections, the networks, the ties that I built in my degree in sociology would be far less valuable to my colleagues in a business school than in a sociology department. And this was the situation that Constance found herself in. She had to rebuild her networks on her own, and she noted that doing so presented significant challenges, which I'll detail now. So Constance, in describing some of the difficulties that she faced in rebuilding these networks, she told me, all the credit I had for being Professor Smith's student, I lost. I went into a new field. No one knew my advisor. The fact that I came out of his group didn't mean anything to them. I was starting over from scratch with no one to vouch for me. That has been my challenge ever since. So we see here that for Constance, this experience of starting over in a brand new field wasn't something that was easy or simple for her. It was a challenge that was stemming not necessarily from her grasp of the science or her ability to understand the particulars of chemical engineering or even to do research. The challenge for her became building those social networks and doing so in a way that felt very isolating to her as a Black woman, as I'll detail in the next few quotes. Constance told me, going to meet people, get in the in crowd, because I'm introverted anyway, on top of being a Black woman, while not being known, it has been terrible. I hate it. If it was just based on merit, if the networks didn't matter so much, I'd be much better positioned. But the networks are what's missing, so I miss out on all kinds of things: awards, nominations, proposals. And here we have Constance making a point that I think is very important, particularly when we consider her employment in chemical engineering, a STEM field. I think we often have this perception that STEM fields, because they are science driven, are ones that are very objectively driven, where the science matters, your knowledge base matters, what you're able to bring as a researcher and as an analyst matters. But what Constance is showing is that while the science is a core part of the fundamentals of the work that she does, equally important are her ability to, or equally important is her embeddedness in these networks, the ability to have referrals for nominations, the ability to have connections that let her know about the possibilities for proposals, the ability to have networks where she's nominated for awards that could be critical for advancement in her career. As a Black woman, Constance is very much underrepresented in this field, and she's very aware that this underrepresentation makes it very difficult for her to integrate into the networks that she needs in order to fulfill these other aspects of her work. And she told me a quote that really drove this home. She said, I was at a conference and there was a guy presenting there, and he talked about how research collaborations depend on personal relationships with people. You ask yourself, would I spend time with this person? Is this someone I want to have dinner with? When he said that, I was just devastated. Because who in this room wants to have dinner with me? And this is why I haven't had any collaborations with anybody since grad school, because I haven't done this. So Constance is making a point here about what happens once she's already in the job, the difficulty and the challenge of forming these networks, of building these relationships. But I want to note and underscore that we know from a significant amount of research data that these existing connections and networks are often what drive people's ability to advance past initial hiring stages and move into jobs in the first place. When Black workers are in positions like Constance, where they are already underrepresented, where they are one of few, and when they are Black women who are doubly underrepresented, this challenge of creating these networks and forming these relationships becomes exacerbated. They may face certain stereotypes about their lack of skill and intelligence. They may, in male-dominated fields, face perceptions that they are not necessarily welcome or suited, or that they are more likely to focus on family and child rearing and don't have the commitment that it takes to succeed in scientific fields. But overwhelmingly, we know that work has moved into a place where this reliance on networks has become really critical and important. But we also know that for Black workers, this reliance on networks means that they are often excluded, not because they lack the skills or the qualifications or the experience, but because they simply aren't perceived as people who fit. So when we think about the cost of networking, it is important to underscore that when networks and connections drive hiring, Black workers easily lose out. Moving into these networks is much harder for them, and building these networks from scratch is particularly challenging. And as I've tried to note from Constance's experience, for Black women in male-dominated fields, these difficulties are exacerbated in ways that highlight both the ways that race and gender matter in terms of their ability to network effectively. I'll turn now to organizational culture. And when we talk about organizational culture, often what we refer to here are the norms, expectations, and values of a given company. These can range from the norms in a culture that emphasize close-knit relationships between coworkers, what researchers may call a clan culture, to the corporate culture or an organizational culture that emphasizes the idea of adhocracy, of moving fast and breaking things, which has been used to characterize social tech companies and Facebook and, excuse me, Meta in particular. But what we know consistently across the board is that organizational culture is rarely created with Black workers in mind. Instead, organizational norms often encourage colorblindness. They encourage workers not to think about or focus on or highlight the ways that racial differences may be present or the ways that they may matter in workplaces and in work outcomes. We also know, though, that these ostensibly race-neutral environments can make it very difficult for Black workers to describe the challenges that they face. And these challenges can include things as explicit as overt harassment, workplaces that tolerate racial slurs, or can include subtle biases, such as a focus on fit or diversity talk that avoids race or is so general as to be pretty much useless. To illustrate these points, I'll talk here about Brian. And Brian is an interesting case of someone who dealt with the organizational culture of his workplace in ways that might seem paradoxical. Brian is a film producer, and he was employed shortly after the Oscars So White controversy of 2015. And for those of you who don't remember, this was a case when, for the second year in a row, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated an all-white slate of candidates for the Best Actor and Best Actress categories. There was social media outcry. The Academy pledged to make some changes. And one of the ways that this change happened was that the studio where Brian was employed said that they wanted to think about things differently and be aware of possible omissions, missteps, or issues that they might not be as attuned to. Specifically, they wanted to focus more on innovation, on new ideas, and they hired Brian specifically because he was very outspoken about his commitment to highlighting the film contributions and telling stories about aspects of Black life and Black experiences. What Brian found, though, despite his excitement and interest in coming to the studio under those conditions, was that he encountered an organizational culture that we might describe as a market-based organizational culture. And this market-based organizational culture meant that many of his colleagues used market logics to justify their aversion to films that had Black leads, Black casts, and Black directors. And they did so by consistently summing up this 5-word phrase that he heard over and over again: these films just don't make money. This is not necessarily accurate. These claims ignore Black consumer audience buying power and data that shows that films that are more diverse actually tend to have higher returns on their investments than those that are not. But we also know from research that these types of arguments are selectively applied to Black but not white filmmakers, such that Black filmmakers are less likely to be able to have other opportunities to continue directing and making films after making movies that don't earn the return on their investment as white filmmakers. And so for Brian, this led to a bit of a paradox and a challenge. He was being hired by a studio that claimed to want to respond to the Oscar So White controversy and to be more attuned to diversity. But when he tried to actually bring studio heads' ideas around this and to do this work, he was rebuffed. And we'll see some examples of this on the next slide. Brian told me everything most people think about vis-a-vis Black filmmaking, all of their assumptions about how the system is rigged against them, and the majority of Black people think that in Hollywood. Those assumptions were proven correct. This is a company that values innovation, values loyalty, values taking initiative, so it claims. But the studio heads put values online that are not espoused. Excuse me. And so what Brian argues here is essentially what I was saying previously, that he was hired at a particular point in time when the studio made a big deal about their commitment to innovation, their commitment to considering new and different projects than those that they had historically been focused on bringing to film. Uh, but what Brian found was that the organizational culture of the studio meant that the market-based culture, even though it was a colorblind culture, even though it was one that seemed to commit to giving more opportunities to a variety of different filmmakers, put him in a bit of a bind where he consistently was in this process of trying to prove that the innovative projects that he wanted to bring to screen were ones that deserved attention and deserved merit. And the following two quotes highlight this more clearly. Brian told me the executive who ultimately took the meeting had shown a lack of interest in what I thought were particularly salient Black-centered projects by celebrated Black writers before. This is the person who passed on Moonlight when it was a project we could have made. And if you were not familiar with Moonlight, it went on to actually win the Best Picture award at the Oscars for the year it was nominated. Anyway, he took the meeting with this filmmaker with me, then the following day suggested to our boss that we pass on the project, but admitted in that email that he had not read the screenplay nor seen the Sundance winning film. So in context, this is a quote from Brian about him essentially trying to bring to his supervisors an idea he had based on a film that based on a screenplay that he had read that he thought might potentially be an impactful film. Remember, this is what Brian was hired to do. The whole point of the studio bringing him in, so they said, was so that he could bring to them projects like these, innovative ideas that they otherwise would not necessarily have been focusing on, things that would draw attention to aspects of Black life and allow them to promote those types of films and allow the studio to back them. But Brian finds himself in a situation where not only is there not as much support for this as he expects, but the organizational culture and the focus on market dynamics gives leaders an opportunity to have particular language that they can use to try to avoid supporting these types of films. And he goes on to say, then he used the psychology that one normally uses in Hollywood to create fear of missing out on one's boss. Usually that logic is there are other parties bidding on it, so if you don't trust your taste, trust others. He used that to sell not bidding. In a crowded biopic field, this would be a tough one to win. Bidding would drive up the price. It would be overvalued. This is a logic he never uses for projects that involve white people. So again, what we see here is an example of an organizational culture that's very market driven, that's very market based, that allows leaders to be able to say, well, this just isn't going to make us money. We're a business here and we can't really advance this project if it's not going to make money. What that ultimately does, however, is creates an organizational culture where even though there rarely is explicit discussion about the systemic racial inequalities that come out of that type of culture, there are still ways that leaders are able to maintain the same dynamics and the same hierarchies when it comes to which films they advance and which ones that they don't. But this organizational culture also put Brian in a place where he had a lot of difficulty articulating just why he felt so frustrated with his job. So when we think about issues with organizational cultures, often these colorblind cultures, whether they are adhocracy cultures, market-based, hierarchical, clan cultures, ultimately they often obscure the patterns that reproduce racial inequalities in the workplace, and they can make it harder for workers to address and discuss these issues when they are present. When we do see companies where they have a focus on diversity, depending on how that is structured, the focus on diversity may result in attention to gender, opinion, viewpoint, factors other than race that may make it more safe and more palatable in certain political environments for companies to continue these initiatives, but ultimately result in a failure to draw attention to the particular dynamics that Black workers encounter. These cultures can serve to marginalize Black workers, constraining their ability to contribute to organizational goals, and they can increase alienation and risks of turnover, which incidentally is exactly what happened to Brian. After a few of our interviews, he revealed to me that he actually had been pursuing other opportunities. He had left the studio where he was employed and moved on to a Black-owned production company that he felt more comfortable about and that he felt more confident would allow him to achieve the goals that he brought to the initial studio. So finally, I'll turn now to this question of advancement. And I think that often in our society, we have this idea that advancement is this meritocratic process where the best person qualified for the job moves up into the leadership role, and that if they get there, it's because they bring in the most money, or they have the most merit, or they've done the best work, or they otherwise deserve it. And interestingly, what we know from research is that is not always the case. It's not always the best qualified person who advances. It's not always the person who brings in the most money. We also know that when it comes to advancement, it's rarely driven by transparent, clearly defined goals and criteria. Advancement is largely subjective. It's often very opaque, and it's often very heavily influenced, not necessarily by output and objective metrics, but more so by relationships with managers and supervisors. Now, in this context, where advancement is very heavily driven by people who are already in managerial roles, we also know that Black workers report the most distance from their supervisors. They are also more likely to be steered away from divisions that are tracks to management roles. So rather than advancement being the straightforward process of a place where the person who is best suited for the leadership role is allowed to advance, what we often have are relationally driven processes by which close relationships with supervisors, with mentors, with advisors really can be the linchpin of determining who advances in companies and who does not. And for Black workers, this presents a real disadvantage because they are more likely to be locked out of those relationships and out of those divisions that facilitate these types of close ties. So I'll talk here about Kevin's experiences in this front. And Kevin is an interesting case because he had work experience that spanned two very different industries. Kevin is a former banker who turned to nonprofit work. So he went from a very male-dominated, very heavily male-dominated environment in the banking and financial industry to a much more women-dominated work environment in the nonprofit sector. But interestingly, Kevin found that he experienced similar challenges in both places. When I talked with him, he was working in the nonprofit sector in an area of the nonprofit world that focused on educational opportunities. And he found that his advancement in the nonprofit sector had stalled. And when he talked with me about why his advancement had stalled, he was pretty clear that his managers had also made clear to him that they did not really see him as a leader. Instead, he was slotted into roles that fit their preconceived notions of where he was best served in the organization. His distant relationships with supervisors made it very hard to transcend these preconceived notions, and ultimately, this resulted in a lot of frustration and a feeling of stalled mobility for him. So here are the quotes that I'll use from Kevin. He was very blunt in talking to me and told me, when it comes to advancement, I have been frustrated. I have been blocked. I feel hampered by white women in terms of where I've gone and what they think I should do. In a nutshell, I would say that that has been my consistent problem. Now, keep in mind for context, Kevin, as I mentioned, is working in the educational area of the nonprofit world. And this is an environment where most of his colleagues, most of his supervisors are white women who also themselves have experienced certain disadvantages in occupational spaces. But Kevin did not see these disadvantages as creating parallel experiences or opportunities for mobility. Instead, he found that for many of his white women colleagues, they saw him again as someone who did not seem to have a very vaguely defined idea of leadership potential. And they saw him as someone who seemed better served doing lower to mid-level work in the organizational hierarchy. He went on to explain, it's the same every time I'm managed by a white woman. They're initially nice and friendly, yet we have no rapport. So then when I need feedback, it's obtuse, given with a side eye. We have this impasse, and then I feel like I need to leave because I feel like I'm going to be fired. If I work with a Black woman, I succeed, get feedback, do well. At another job, I was managed by a Black man and a white man. That was always good, fine. But in the nonprofit space, it is a world of mostly white women. I believe I'm speaking the story of many other Black men in nonprofits or education who have to hide or disfigure themselves, or they would be kicked out the door. And so Kevin's account here is pretty consistent with much of the research on Black men working in these types of environments, who describe a pretty consistent process of having to engage in who engage in a process of heavily self-managing, of impression management, of trying to make sure that in particular, they do not present themselves as people who are threatening, people who are overbearing, people who seem too ambitious or seem too assertive, because all of these, in their view, often reinforce stereotypes of Black men and Black masculinity that make it difficult to not only advance, but form the types of relationships with white women who may be in supervisory roles, who may find that type of assertiveness or aggressiveness in some cases threatening rather than inspiring or encouraging. And Kevin went on to say, it's a whole balancing act where I'm trying to modulate my voice, my behavior, and it's hard because I want to be an ally. But if I'm a normal Black guy who doesn't read up on those things, that you always have to be non-threatening, that you have to use a certain voice, then I'm not going to succeed because I'm not going to advance. Again, the issue with Kevin's advancement was not a question of skill, experience, criteria, education, and so forth. The issue with Kevin's advancement was the idea that without these relationships with supervisors that were difficult to forge and to strengthen because of the ways in which he was constantly engaging in this process of impression management and trying to make sure that he didn't present himself as someone too threatening, too frightening, too loud, too whatever, that he necessarily was going to see those relationships lessened and find the difficulties that he did experience in moving ahead in the career field. So when we think about invisible barriers to advancement, it's useful to remind ourselves that managers are very decisive in determining who moves into leadership. But for Black workers, undefined ideas of fit are a hindrance. They require extensive work to offset, and race and gender can make some workers seem like less of a match for leadership roles. And that white women, even though they are also a relatively disadvantaged group in the workforce, to the extent that they are also underrepresented in many high-ranking leadership positions, may also seem to present obstacles for Black workers, particularly Black men, even though they are not necessarily overrepresented in these high-status positions. So in summary, I want to make a few points that encapsulate the arguments that I've tried to offer in this presentation. One is that everyday aspects of how we work contain numerous pitfalls and obstacles for Black workers. When we think about the disparities that I mentioned at the onset of this presentation between our high-ranking industries and what the demographics of our country look like, those disparities, again, are not because we haven't been talking about diversity for the last 30 years. Those disparities are not because we lack Black workers who are interested, who are qualified, who are ambitious. And those disparities are not because we are necessarily seeing legal, explicit outright discrimination persist. Instead, what we do know is that when we take a deep dive and look closely into the key aspects of how we work, there are often aspects of that work that can make it very difficult for Black workers to thrive and succeed. When it comes to hiring, this is present in the reliance on social networks that sidelines Black applicants and Black employees. When it comes to organizational culture, this is present in a race-neutral climate that can make it harder to see the patterns that facilitate disparities. When it comes to advancement, we know that managers have an outsized role in promotion, yet they also have more distance from Black workers than they do closeness. Ultimately, these processes of how we work are contributing to the racial inequality that we continue to see today. But I want to note at the close of this presentation that there actually are solutions. Now, they are certainly more daunting now in our current socio-political climate than they were 5 years ago or even 1 year ago. But it is important to know that we do have research that does document that organizations can do things differently so that our companies do not have to be so very disconnected from the population, our population demographics at large. When it comes to hiring, I've talked a lot about social networks and relationships and how critical those are in moving into jobs in the first place. One of the things that we know works is that when managers consider organizations and groups outside of their social networks, they actually become familiar with whole arrays of talented workers that they were not necessarily exposed to prior. When managers consider historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, as places from which they want to incorporate in their recruitment process, they become privy to networks and connections of workers that otherwise might not be in their existing social ties, but who are hungry, who are motivated, who are people who could become very valuable assets in the organization. And we know this again from data and research that shows that when companies restrict themselves to the places where they already have networks, they are more likely to come to a homogenous pool and less likely to see a broad array of potential workers. When it comes to organizational culture, I just have to say, first and foremost, especially in this particular cultural moment, it is critical for companies to recommit to the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Despite the legal landscape that we are in, it is not illegal for companies to, yet, not yet, it is not illegal for companies to attend to and to consider how diversity and inclusion matter. And we see differences in places like Costco and JP Morgan Chase, which have reaffirmed their commitment to diversity, than we do in places like Target or Walmart that are starting to step back and to distance themselves from those prior commitments. I think at this moment, when companies have a choice, if they are serious about these issues that are facing workers, then it is all the more important right now to offer this recommitment to diversity and to continue along the lines of using the evidence and doing the things that work. When it comes to doing this evidence of changing the organizational culture, we know that companies can establish task forces to identify pain points in the organization. So a task force that is comprised of workers who are internal to the company can be better poised to identify where there might be lapses or mismatches. Is a company, for example, doing a great job at the hiring stage, but seeing itself with workers that are kind of tapping out at middle management level? If so, that is a thing to address and to identify. As a company putting into place policies that disproportionately have an adverse impact on Black workers? Again, that is a thing that a task force can identify. And these are steps that companies can take to make sure that they are actively walking their recommitment to diversity so that their efforts match what they are saying. Finally, when it comes to advancement, companies can engage in mentoring programs for all. We know that in many spaces, private sector companies engage in mentoring programs that are by invitation only, or where only those who are considered high performers are selected in. What those types of programs tend to do is reinforce existing disparities that are already present. High performers who are selected in are likely to be people who don't necessarily need mentoring programs because they already have those embedded. But when companies engage in mentoring programs for all and make sure that everybody has the opportunity to be matched with a mentor, we're likely to see more involvement in those programs, and we're likely to see those programs pay off with more successes. And finally, companies can provide more clarity and more transparency around expectations for promotions so that the expectations that are present, or excuse me, so that the criteria that are present are not as consistently vague and opaque as they have been in ways that make it more difficult for workers who are not fully plugged in and enmeshed into social systems to advance. Ultimately, what I've tried to argue today is that we can look at aspects of our workplaces and look at aspects of how we're working to see areas where there are continuing and ongoing patterns that contribute to the disparities that we do see. But I think it's equally important to highlight that we also have data, we have research that does document the things that companies can do differently. And in an environment that we have today where our population is only poised to become increasingly more racially diverse, it is all the more important for companies to make sure that they are sticking to their guns, so to speak, and that they are making sure that they are reaffirming their commitment so that we can look towards a future where our leadership and our companies look more reflective of where our country's racially diverse future is going and look less like the past that we can't return to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sarah, can you pin me for me or highlight me? Well, Adina, I have several questions. Thank you so much. I have several questions in the chat. The chat has been active, and I am rightfully so. Just for some context, Adina, I know I didn't get a chance to introduce myself when we first got here. I work in the Center for Career Engagement here at WashU, so I am a career coach. So this topic is near and dear to my heart as I work with a lot of BIPOC people in the community and of course, myself, right? So let's get started. So I guess my first question would be just, so how does the way we work maintain racism, and who is the we that we're referring to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I think about kind of that core question, what I think is that the normative processes for how we work are maintaining these racial hierarchies, right? So I'm not thinking about this in terms of companies engaging in the type of explicit, overt racist behavior of yesteryear, right? We don't still have companies that can legally say, well, we're just not going to hire Black workers. And we don't have companies that can legally say anymore, we're not going to hire you because you're Black or you're a woman or what have you. That type of explicit overt discrimination is illegal. But what we do have are many companies and many industries where if you look at the breakdown in the representation of where workers are present, we are much more likely to see workers of color concentrated at the bottom. We are much more likely to see exclusive or largely homogenous racial representation at the top, where leadership is disproportionately white and often disproportionately white and male. And so one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in my career is what a disadvantage that does to us as a society when we know that our society is becoming increasingly racially diverse. This picture of many organizations that we have and many industries that we have, where there's such a hierarchy and such a gap between what our society actually looks like and this clear and present hierarchy in terms of what leadership looks like versus the middle management versus the rank and file, does not bode well for a future where our population is becoming increasingly diverse, because it suggests that there's some sort of problem in making sure that everybody has access to leadership roles and everybody has access to being present at all levels of the organization. And so when I talk about the way that we work perpetuating racism, what I'm talking about is the normative practices that go into how we all work and engage in workplaces and engage in the process of work, and how those normative processes are structured in ways that I think often unwittingly leave us in this situation where our workplaces are still very hierarchically driven and very racially hierarchically structured, even if we are not still engaging in those processes of discrimination that were present 50 or 60 years ago.
Yes, totally agree with you on that one. So, based on organizational culture and networks, how could one improve their upward mobility if the culture in your workplace does not encourage it or necessarily know how to foster it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question also. And I'm not sure there's a kind of one size fits all answer for that, right? Because what I think I hear you asking is how to move forward in an organization that might not necessarily be super encouraging or super
Yeah,
welcoming or have these types of
right.
policies in place, right? So we may have some cases where there are people who do manage to move forward in those organizations, whether by virtue of having access to a mentor or a sponsor who's able to facilitate that type of relationship that leads to mobility, whether through persistence, whether through opportunities to kind of go outside of the traditional boundaries to leadership and moving into advancement by taking a more unorthodox approach. But my field is sociology. We think about what happens at the group level, not at the individual level. And I tend to feel like it's more useful for companies to think about how they can take on a leadership role and how organizations can take on a role to restructure and change the norms that are happening in organizations, so that it's not up to one person to think, how can I do this on my own? I don't think that should be one person's job or responsibility. I think that's the responsibility of the company to make sure that they are thinking, how can I think expansively so that all workers have opportunities to move into leadership roles, and so that one person doesn't have to weigh this themselves.
Gotcha. Thank you. Um, so I know throughout the presentation you talked about the importance of networking and getting to understand where the power is, I guess if you want to call it that. Um, so it almost sounds like affirmative action just wasn't working to begin with. So how will the current political climate impact the exclusion or the inclusion of a diverse workplace? You know this
So,
is coming.
yeah. So I will say this. I don't know that I would agree that affirmative action was
Mhm,
not working. I think it depends on how exactly it was implemented, and what the goals were. And I don't think the goals were consistently implemented across organizations and across industries. I think it varied a lot, right? So
mhm,
we know, for example, that data has shown overwhelmingly that actually the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action were actually white women, right? So
mhm,
affirmative action certainly yielded some major changes in how our organizations were structured and how our workforces looked. That is not to say that it did not work. It just depends on kind of what goals a company had and what types of measures they put into place. I will say that in our current climate, this is ex probably the most explicitly hostile that I have seen, I
mhm.
think, in my adult career to these issues related to diversity, racial equity in workplaces, and so forth, that I've seen as a kind of a working adult. That said, I don't think that it is impossible for excuse me, for organizations to course correct. And that was why at the end of the presentation, I cited the difference in places like Costco and JP Morgan Chase versus places like Walmart and Target, right? On the one hand, you have examples of companies that are reaffirming their commitment to diversity. On the other hand, you have examples of companies that are not. I think what we will end up seeing possibly is that companies that continue to reaffirm their commitment, depending on if they are able to do so with resources and if they are able to do so in a way that follows the evidence, may be more likely to see a longer term share of economic improvement over time than those that retreat. And the reason I say that is that the data is also pretty clear that more diversity boosts innovation. Companies that have better diversity policies in place see more revenues. This is a benefit to business, and it is a benefit to corporations because it allows them to draw from a wider wealth of talent, skill, and expertise than artificially narrowing the population of workers from which they draw. So right now we're in a place where the political environment is very, very hostile to this, but it's not. There are still routes to following these pathways to doubling down on and committing to DEI. And I think that companies that are able to continue doing that for as long as they can continue doing that are going to be able to point to some success stories as a result.
Thank you. Sorry, the chat is still very active. I'm trying to catch some of the questions as we go. Um, but I have a question around, I'm curious about how BIPOC or just people of color have experienced white-splaining away things when people of color come up with ideas. Do you have any insight into how do we deal with that when we're trying to, make space in either programming ideas or just moving forward in
Yeah,
the
that's an
organization?
I'm sorry, I thought you were.
Oh, you get
Okay.
you get.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. I mean, the way that I think about what I've talked about today, I would categorize that as an example of organizational culture. It's not limited to organizational culture, but I think we can think about companies that I think we can think about this as an example of the benefit for companies that are attuned to racial dynamics as part of the organizational culture, right? If you were in a company where the organizational culture is a more colorblind one, then it's going to be hard to have language to talk about and identify why and how white splaining is detrimental to organizational performance and to workers' ability to succeed and thrive, right? Because there's not a way in the organizational confines to say, hey, this is a problem. I'm being undermined. I'm dealing with these colleagues who are not really committed to a fair exchange of ideas and to listening carefully and to understanding my perspectives as opposed to theirs, right? If you are in a company where the organizational culture is one that is a bit more race conscious, then presumably that could give more of a language and provide more receptivity to being able to describe the fact that that is a thing that often happens to Black workers and Black employees, and to be able to acknowledge that as a part of an organizational culture that is not necessarily aligned with what could be a mission of giving all employees the opportunity to thrive and to be heard and to succeed. So I'm not sure if this is answering the question exactly, but I think that that is a common enough experience among many Black workers that it then goes back to the importance of having an organizational culture in place that allows for the recognition of that, the acknowledgement of it, and the importance of moving towards organizational norms and dynamics where that can be identified and addressed.
Thank you. I know most of the examples that you gave today it appeared that most people were like of one race. And so I'm wondering if there is like research that talks about bi or multiracial folks, such as a person who may be Black, white, or Afro-Latino. Um, is is it largely how others, such as managers, kind of assign the race to the person or the identity that someone identifies themselves? Like, is there any research that talks about their experiences, or is it more just kind of siloed one race and then another?
Yeah. So this is a bit adjacent, but the research that I do know of, it's less about multiracial individuals and more about colorism and how that can be a factor in shaping experiences in workplaces, but outside of workplaces broadly. So I don't know of any studies that focus explicitly on multiracial individuals, but my guess based on the research and the data that we do have would likely be that physical appearance and how they are perceived would likely be a large part of how they are shaped and categorized by other coworkers, by supervisors, and what implications that might have for their ability to thrive and move forward in the organization.
Gotcha. Can you talk more about stereotypes about Black people, particularly Black women, and how those affects how that affects a Black woman in the workplace.
Yeah, so this is an area where there is a pretty decent amount of data and research. We know that Black women are often stereotyped as being less qualified, less intelligent, more likely to be angry, more likely to be single mothers. All of those stereotypes can have implications for how they are perceived by colleagues and colleagues and employers. Those types of stereotypes can facilitate the unwillingness or the difficulties that Black women face finding mentors, finding sponsors, finding people who are willing to advocate for them. They can also contribute to an increased likelihood of being passed over for promotion or advancement opportunities. The irony is that Black women are more likely than women of other racial groups to express interest in promotion and to express faith in their abilities to actually do the jobs that are required for advancement and moving ahead. They express more interest in wanting higher salaried jobs, and they are disproportionately likely to be more highly educated than many other groups as well. So there's a real mismatch between the stereotypes and the realities. But the unfortunate reality is that the stereotypes often take precedence over what the realities actually show. I spoke before about statistical discrimination versus preferential discrimination. In many cases, ideas about the that ideas that people have about stereotypes mean that they are drawing from preferential discrimination, but they also may draw from statistical discrimination, both in ways that adversely impact Black women's opportunities for mobility and advancement in companies.
Thank you. I totally agree with you on that one because as many people as I see, they don't even think about asking, right? Or even talking about it, especially for promotions or anything like that. There was a great question in the chat. What would you say is step one for a primary white nonprofit organization professing to do equity work and looking to recommit?
I think step one, I mean, as a social scientist, I like data and I'm always going to want people to to look at the data. So I'd have to say to do an internal audit, to do an internal audit and to look at what is actually happening in the organization based on data, not just perceptions or feelings, but where are your workers concentrated? Where are they coming from? What is your organizational goal? And are you able to meet it if there is a mismatch between what the staff looks like versus what the population that you're serving looks like? And these are questions that companies, I think, both for-profit companies and nonprofit companies can and should be asking themselves on a pretty consistent basis. It's really critical, in my view, for companies to be able to do these audits internally on a periodic basis to assess what the staff looks like, what the goals are of the company, where there are problems kind of achieving the diversity that many companies will say that they want. And those aren't things that I think you can answer unless you're actually pulling from concrete data, quantitative and qualitative, to assess where things lie in a company and what the goals are and how they are either being closer to being met or where they are falling short.
And I'm going to ask one last question here because I want to give Sarah a chance to wrap up here. But the thing that keeps coming through the chat, like overwhelmingly, is how do we continue this conversation? Are there discussion groups? Is there something that we can get into it? Because I mean, there's people here that want to talk about it and really move forward in these type of discussions. Do you have any of those available? Do we just buy your book? What are some things?
Well, my my publisher would be very upset if I did not encourage people to buy the book. But I think again, it varies. I think from what I saw early on in the chat, people are coming from all over the place. They're coming from different environments. And so I would say to take these discussions back to your workplace, take these discussions back to leadership in particular. It's hugely important for leadership to be on board and to be a part of these types of conversations and discussions. But I also think that in this current moment, I think that if leaders see that this is something that continues to matter to workers, if this is something that workers continue to value, it becomes a lot harder to retreat if or leaders know that this is something that matters to the people who are in their employ and to the workers that they have. So I think it's just really critical to make sure that people are taking these conversations back to wherever they are locally, but making sure that they are keeping a bit of pressure on people who are in leadership positions to let them know this matters, this is important, and this is valuable. And we don't have to proactively comply with directives that haven't been issued yet. This matters in terms of shaping where our society is going. This matters from a business standpoint. This is better for the company to be focused on these issues. Let's stay with this discussion and stay with this conversation and make sure that we are being consistent.
Thank you so much, Adina. You've been amazing. And I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to close us out. Thank you.
I have too many screens open. Sorry, everybody. I was trying to find the right thing to click on. Adia, thank you so much for your research, your scholarship, and maybe most importantly, for sharing it with us today on this platform. Thank you to everybody who is here today. The chat was wonderfully, very active, a really great response and so much encouragement, and people really being actively involved in this. I put a link in the chat, but the recording of today's presentation will be shared, and then you can share that widely with anybody. There aren't any permissions on it. We won't be sharing the slide deck, but the recording itself will be shared. And then I want to just plug the last two presentations in our Black History Month series that are coming up. Next week, Thursday, February 20th, we have Malik Ahmed from Better Family Life with us. And then the following week, on Thursday, February 27th, we have Dr. Sharita Butler Barnes, who's a professor here at Washington University at the Brown School, with us to close out this year's programming. And those are both free. They also will be recorded in case you can't make those dates and times, but we would love to have you there and engaging with us again. And then the last bit is just, I dropped the link to Dr. Wingfield's book in the chat. It's also available at the library. One of the participants let us know. So it seems like a lot of you are hungry and eager to learn more about this. And so please keep engaging. Happy Black History Month, February, and all day, every day throughout the year. Thank you everybody for joining. Bye.